Let's imagine you're hiking along a high, exposed mountain ridge. Cold wind in your face, boots scraping on loose rock, nothing but empty sky on either side. You might think the only thing you have to worry about up here is slipping, but what you actually find is way stranger. Something whistles past your ear. Close. Too close. Before you can even turn your head, it hits the rocks in front of you and explodes. Not a bullet. Not a falling stone. A long, pale bone detonates on the cliff like a grenade, shards shattering out in all directions. You freeze. Tiny knives of bone skitter past your boots and rattle into the abyss. If that had hit your skull instead of the rock? You do not want to run that simulation. You look up. A shadow crosses the ridge. Slow, lazy, like it owns the entire mountain. Above you, a giant bird with a wingspan close to 3 meters is circling, black and rust feathers catching the light, wedge-shaped tail twitching as it rides the thin air. Its claws are empty. No rabbit dangling, no strip of meat. Just open talons and a very intense stare. For a moment it hangs there, almost motionless. Then it folds its wings and drops. You watch, in weird slow motion, as it dives far below you, down toward a carcass sprawled on a scree slope. Every normal scavenger is long gone. The meat is stripped. The hide is torn. All that's left is a skeleton. And that's exactly what it wants. The bird doesn't even glance at the scraps of dried flesh. It reaches straight for a huge leg bone, clamps down, and beats its wings hard, hauling this awkward white club back into the sky. Higher, higher, 50 meters, 60, maybe 80. Then it lets go. The bone falls. You track it as it tumbles, end over end, until it slams into a flat patch of rock and explodes just like the first one. Dinner is served. By gravity. See, most predators treat bone like packaging. Too hard, too dense, too much effort. Flesh is easy mode. Bone is the part everyone else leaves behind because it's basically stone with calories. But this bird has gone all in on hard mode. Up to 90% of its diet can be bone. Not just the rich, fatty marrow inside, but the bone itself, swallowed in chunks up to 25 centimeters long and dissolved by stomach acid strong enough to turn a cow's femur into soup. This is the bearded vulture, also called the lammergeier. And yes, these guys are all real. This is the world of a bird that has evolved to live almost entirely on bones. So how do you rewrite your entire body plan to eat what nobody else can? How does a creature that weaponizes falling skeletons change the mountains it lives in? To answer that, we need to get a lot closer to the bird that just threw a bone at your head. So, let's imagine you follow that bone that just got yeeted past your face. Your eyes track it down, down, down to a ledge dusted with snow and old skeletons. You look up, and suddenly the camera pulls way back. You're not on one mountain anymore. You're in an entire kingdom of them. Snow-streaked cliffs in the Alps, knife-edge ridges in the Caucasus, huge, cold valleys in the Himalayas where the air is thin and the drop is not survivable. This is the world of the bearded vulture, high, remote, and basically a giant gravity-powered meat grinder. Things fall, things freeze, and the mountains quietly pile up with dead. You might think this is paradise for scavengers, and it is, just not in a cute way. When something dies up here, the first wave hits fast. Ravens, crows, foxes, maybe a wolf pack if you're really unlucky. Then the classic vultures spiral down like feathered trash compactors. They go for the good stuff first, because of course they do. Muscle, organs, fat. Within hours, the soft parts are gone. What you actually find if you time-lapse a carcass is that it gets stripped to clean bone with ridiculous efficiency. Hyenas in Africa, jackals in Asia, even tiny beetles in the cracks all agree on one thing: bones are the leftovers. The takeout box nobody really wants to open. And that's exactly when the bearded vulture shows up. Not in a frenzy, in slow motion. Wings out, tail fanned, just casually surfing the updrafts over a skeleton the way you might cruise a nearly empty fridge. See? The cleanup crew has already come and gone. This is the cleanup crew for the cleanup crew. While everyone else has moved on, the bearded vulture walks in like, "Wow, you guys left the best part." It calmly picks up femurs, vertebrae, even entire ribs, sometimes bones up to the length of your forearm, and flies off with them like a dog that stole the world's most illegal chew toy. And yes, these guys are all real. Wild birds that have decided meat is basically a side salad. Between 70 and 90% of a bearded vulture's diet is bone. Not just a snack, not an emergency backup. Bone is the main course, making it the most bone-specialized vertebrate we know about. No mammal, no other bird, not even hyenas get anywhere close to that level of commitment. Which raises a pretty obvious question. Why? Bones are heavy. They're hard. Per gram, they have way less accessible energy than fat. You can't just nibble a femur like it's a granola bar. Evolution usually rewards easy calories, not the edible equivalent of a locked safe. So what pushed this bird into the weirdest niche on the mountain? Why bet your entire survival on the one part of the carcass everyone else has already rejected? To answer that, you have to see what this vulture does to a bone once it's in the air, and what its stomach does once the pieces finally hit the gut. So, here's the twist. While almost everything up here is fighting over meat, this bird has basically opted out of the flesh economy. You might think, okay, but lots of animals chew bones. Dogs crunch them, hyenas crack them, humans roast them for marrow. But what you actually find with the bearded vulture is something way more extreme. Up to 90% of its diet can be bone, not scraps, not a side dish. Bone is the main course. As far as we know, it is the only vertebrate on the planet that lives like this. This is the world of dietary specialists. You've seen versions of this before. Vampire bats that drink almost nothing but blood. Koalas that basically run on eucalyptus and stubbornness. Giant pandas pretending bamboo is food. But bone eating? That's on an even weirder level, because bone is supposed to be the part of the animal that nothing really eats. Let's imagine you're a scavenger in the high mountains. The ecosystem runs on chaos. Days of nothing, then suddenly a yak slips. A wild goat misjudges a cliff. A sheep dies in a snowstorm. Huge carcasses appear out of nowhere. Feast, but also famine, because every predator, crow, fox, and fellow vulture can smell that jackpot from miles away. For a few frantic hours, it's a giant, bloody Black Friday sale. Soft tissue gets stripped fast. Eyes, tongue, organs, muscle, gone. If you're late, you're out of luck. And in a cold, thin air environment, where flying costs a lot of energy, losing that race over and over is a really bad life plan. But look at what's left after the chaos. Bones. Piles of them. Hard, white, and mostly ignored. They don't rot quickly in the cold. They don't get dragged off as easily. They just sit there, loaded with fat-rich marrow and minerals, like abandoned energy bars someone forgot to lock. See? Evolution is really good at noticing free stuff. Bones are a stable, long-lasting resource, basically a slow-release calorie battery. The catch is that they're also engineered to be the toughest part of a body, built to resist snapping, crushing, and, annoyingly, digestion. Great if you're alive. Terrible if you're trying to eat them. So the bearded vulture does something radical. It specializes. Its entire design starts bending around this one problem. How do you turn rock-hard calcium into usable fuel? How do you crack a cow femur without shattering your own face? How do you swallow a 20-centimeter shard without dying and then actually dissolve it? And yes, these guys are all real. A bird that treats bones like protein bars, then somehow melts them down inside a stomach that's basically an acid-filled blast furnace. But what kind of body do you need to pull that off? In the next part, you're going to watch this vulture weaponize gravity, and then we'll open up its gut chemistry, where things get even stranger. So before this bird can weaponize gravity, or run its stomach like a tiny industrial plant, you need to understand the villain of this story, bone. You might think bone is just hard white stuff, basically nature's chalk stick. But what you actually find, if you zoom in, is a ridiculously overbuilt composite material that's basically designed to say nope to anything trying to eat it. Let's imagine you slice a bone in half. On the outside, you've got dense, rock-like tissue loaded with calcium phosphate crystals. That's the mineral part, the reason bones feel like little cold stones. Woven through that is collagen, a stretchy protein scaffold. Put those together, and you get something that's strong like ceramic, but just flexible enough not to shatter every time an animal jumps, falls, or fights. It's like nature wrapped fiberglass in concrete and then installed it inside your body. That's great if you're trying to survive. It's terrible if you're trying to chew it. Most predators don't even bother with the bone itself. What they actually want is the good stuff hidden inside. Marrow. Marrow is pure energy math cheating. It's rich in fat, calories, and nutrients, all packaged in a protected tube that's really hard to open without the right tools. So, who even tries? Hyenas show up with bone-crushing teeth and jaws strong enough to turn an antelope leg into gravel. Wolves and dogs will gnaw the ends off long bones to suck out the marrow, then give up when they hit the thick shaft. Humans went, okay, fine, and invented stone tools, then metal ones, just to smash bones open. And yes, these guys are all real examples of evolution throwing hardware at the problem, and they still tend to leave the biggest, densest bones lying around. See, bones are heavy. Dragging a huge leg bone around costs energy. Smashing it costs even more. Every bite you take wears down your teeth, risks fractures, and takes time you could spend chasing something softer. And that's just the mechanical side. Chemically, bone is a nightmare. All that calcium phosphate is tough to dissolve, and collagen is a protein rope that needs serious acid and enzymes to break apart. For most animals, when you do the energy math, bone just doesn't pay off. The cost is bigger than the reward, so now drop our bearded vulture into this problem. If you want to live on bones, not just snack on them, you have to solve 3 brutal challenges. First, transport. How do you move these heavy, awkward chunks around a mountain landscape without wasting all your calories? Second, fragmentation. How do you turn a solid, reinforced tube into swallowable pieces without having hyena-grade jaws? Third, digestion. Once it's inside you, how do you actually melt down something designed to resist both impacts and stomach acid? This is the world of an animal that basically treats bones like locked safes full of fat. And somehow, this bird has evolved ways to handle all 3 problems, using cliffs like hammers and running stomach chemistry that makes your acid reflux look adorable. So, how do you turn a carcass's leftovers into an all-you-can-eat buffet? Next, you're going to watch the bearded vulture turn the entire mountain into its personal bone-smashing machine. So, how do you turn a mountain into cutlery? You start by shopping for the right bones. The bearded vulture doesn't just grab whatever is lying around. It walks around a carcass like a picky customer, zeroing in on the giant leg bones of sheep, goats, or wild ungulates, because those are basically fat-filled batteries with a hard shell. You might think a bird that lives on bones would go for small, easy ones. But what you actually find is this thing hauling femurs that look way too big for it, clamped tight in those talons. Then it launches off the slope and heads for a very specific kind of place, a rocky outcrop or cliff ledge that functions as its personal smash zone, called an ossuary. Let's imagine you're riding along on its back. It climbs, wings pumping, up to around 50, 60, sometimes 80 meters above that patch of rock. Not just anywhere on the mountain either. The same scarred, pale slab it's used 100 times before, polished with bone dust and shattered fragments. This bird has favorite anvils. Up there, it starts circling, tiny head flicking down, checking the angle, adjusting for wind like a feathery ballistics computer. Then, at just the right moment, it does something that feels wrong for a predator. It lets go. The bone tumbles in slow motion, spinning toward the rock below, and for a second, your brain is like, wait, did it just drop its dinner? Impact. The bone slams into the rock with a crack that echoes off the cliffs. The vulture folds its wings, dives after it, and lands to inspect the damage like a very judgy chef. Did it split into long, swallowable shards? Are the ends blown open so it can get at the marrow? If not, well, gravity gets another turn. Individuals have been seen dropping the exact same bone over and over, sometimes a dozen times, until it finally shatters into pieces small enough to gulp. This is not mindless. You can watch them adjust height or slightly shift the drop point, as if they're taking feedback from every failed attempt. Evolution built the hardware, but the software is clearly learning on the job. And yes, these guys are all real. Young bearded vultures actually kind of suck at this. Juveniles will drop bones in the wrong place, on soft ground, or from heights that are way too low, then have to awkwardly pick them up and try again. For years. This is the world of a bird that has to go to bone school. See, what you're watching is a vertebrate using the landscape as a tool. It's turned cliffs into giant hammers and rock shelves into anvils, outsourcing jaw strength to gravity, just to unlock the calories trapped inside. So, if this is the violence it does outside the body, what kind of monster chemistry is waiting inside its stomach? So, if the outside show is cliff drop bone explosions, what happens when the pieces are finally small enough to eat? You might think the bird would now daintily nibble away like a polite hawk. But what you actually find is way dumber and way more hardcore. It just swallows the bones. Whole. Up to about 25 centimeters long. Let's imagine you're holding a chunk of sheep femur the length of your forearm. A bearded vulture looks at that and goes, snack size. Once the rockwork has turned a leg into long shards and thick chips, this bird barely bothers to chew. It just lines the piece up, tilts its head, and sends it down the hatch like a kid losing a sword-swallowing bet. To pull that off without instantly dying, the whole front end of the bird has been redesigned. The head is long and narrow, almost spear-shaped, not the big, blocky skull you see in eagles. That shape lets it grab a bone, aim it straight down the throat, and keep it aligned so the sharp edges don't scrape sideways. Then the neck kicks in. Those neck muscles are huge because they're not just for flying balance, they're basically pistons, driving solid material down the esophagus. Inside the mouth, it gets even weirder. Typical raptors have beaks and tongues built to rip and pull soft flesh. This is the world of tearing, not gulping, But the bearded vulture's tongue is longer and more muscular, with rough inner mouth surfaces that act like rails. See, when you're trying to send a slippery, irregular bone fragment into your body, the last thing you want is it spinning randomly. The tongue and palate guide it, roll it into a safer orientation, and keep the pointed ends under control. And then you hit the throat and upper digestive tract, which look like evolution wrapped them in bubble wrap and elastic. The crop and esophagus are highly stretchable and reinforced, so they can park sharp-edged chunks temporarily without puncturing anything vital. You might think a 25-centimeter splinter of cow leg would just stab straight through. But this bird's tissues are tough and rubbery, flexing around the bone and holding it until gravity and muscle waves pass it deeper. All of this is just the loading dock. The real nightmare is what happens next, because even if you can swallow a giant bone like a noodle, you still have to turn rock-hard calcium and collagen into usable calories. And yes, these guys are all real. This isn't fantasy metallurgy. Somewhere below that armored crop is a stomach that has to do something close to impossible. Chemically melt dense bone fast enough to keep a cold, high-flying giant alive. So, what kind of acid does it take to erase a cow's femur? Let's imagine you could actually shrink down and ride along with that bone as it drops past the crop and into the real danger zone, the bearded vulture's stomach. You might think your own stomach is pretty intense after a sketchy burrito, but what you actually find in here makes human digestion look like a gentle spa day. See, your stomach acid usually hangs out somewhere between pH 1.5 and 3. On paper, that already sounds scary. That's strong enough to slowly dissolve things like razor blades in lab tests, given enough time and enough acid. It's why you don't want it coming back up your throat. But for a bird that eats rocks with calories, pretty strong doesn't cut it. The bearded vulture is playing in a different league. Measurements and estimates put its stomach at around pH 1, sometimes even dipping lower. That's not just a little stronger. That's a huge jump in corrosiveness on a logarithmic scale, turning the gut into something closer to a portable acid bath specifically tuned to attack calcium-rich bone. This is the world of an animal that treats a sheep's tibia like you treat a breadstick. Once those shattered fragments land in the stomach, they don't just pass through, they're parked. Bathed in this ultra-acidic soup for hours at a time, every surface is under chemical assault. The hard mineral matrix, mostly calcium phosphate, starts to dissolve away, releasing calcium and phosphorus into solution. At the same time, the collagen, the protein scaffolding that makes bone tough and flexible, gets broken down, peeling the structure apart and exposing any last pockets of fatty marrow hiding inside. You'd think that kind of chemistry would just melt the bird from the inside out, right? Well, that's where the engineering gets wild. The stomach wall is heavily reinforced with a thick lining and a constant production of mucus, creating a slippery shield between the acid and the tissue. Cells on that inner surface turn over fast, like a self-replacing tile floor, so any damage gets swapped out before it becomes a problem. It's basically running a tiny industrial acid plant inside a bag that's constantly repairing itself. And while other scavengers are elbow-deep in rotting meat, rolling the dice on whatever bacteria came free with the carcass, our bone eater is quietly dodging a lot of that mess. Old bones carry fewer soft tissues where microbes thrive, and then you drop those bones into a pH 1 blender. Most pathogens don't stand a chance. Oh, the same system that lets the bird mine calcium and fat from what looks like trash also nukes a huge chunk of the germs that would make another animal sick. So, you end up with this strange trade. A bird that eats the hardest part of the carcass, but might actually have fewer disease problems than the guys fighting over the juicy bits. But if your entire life depends on bones, you still need one more trick. Knowing exactly which rock, which height, and which bone will explode into the perfect swallowable shards. So you've got a bird dropping cow femurs onto a personal rock anvil like it's running a medieval recycling plant. Cool stunt. But how do you actually live off the rubble? What's inside a bone that's worth all this drama? Let's imagine you slice one of those long leg bones clean in half. On the outside, you've got this pale, rock-hard shell packed with minerals like calcium and phosphorus. That part is basically nature's concrete. On the inside, though, you hit the jackpot. Marrow. Soft, greasy, calorie-dense marrow that's mostly fat, with some cells and proteins mixed in. You might think the bearded vulture is just eating rocks, but what you actually find is a flying creature mainlining concentrated animal butter. Here's the catch. Minerals don't give you calories. You can't burn calcium for energy, no matter how hungry you get. But for a bird, especially a big one living in cold, high mountains, minerals are still a huge deal. Calcium and phosphorus are the core ingredients for its own skeleton, for those long, narrow wings, and for building absurdly tough eggshells that won't crack every time a gust of alpine wind shoves the nest around. See, when you spend your life at 3,000 meters up, you're dealing with thin air, brutal temperature swings, and slopes that basically scream, "Fall off me." Having a constantly topped-up mineral supply means stronger bones, faster repair if something chips or fractures, and a steady stream of raw material for all the quiet metabolic chemistry ticking along in the background. It's like carrying your own hardware store in your food. But the real fuel? That's the marrow. Fat is the premium gas of the animal world. Gram for gram, it holds more than twice the energy of sugars or proteins, which is exactly what you want if you're a giant bird that spends hours soaring in cold, thin air, barely flapping, but still burning through calories just to stay warm and keep those wings level. A single big shard of marrow-rich bone can be the equivalent of a full-on feast without the mess of tearing into meat. And the bearded vulture's digestive system is tuned to squeeze every last drop out of this weird menu. Its stomach acid is so strong, it can dissolve dense bone in about a day, breaking that mineral shell down into usable ions while freeing up every smear of trapped fat. Those shards you saw it swallow? They don't just rattle through. They're chemically erased. Well, almost erased. What comes out the other end is this fine, chalky dust. Minimal waste, maximum extraction. This is the world of a specialist, a gut-shaped, timed, and acid-bombed to turn rock into fuel, and ecologically, that obsession pays off. By targeting bones, bearded vultures tap into a reliable, almost ignored energy reserve. When other scavengers have stripped a carcass bare, when meat is gone and competition is still fierce, the lammergeier can still show up late and walk away with the best part. So, you end up with a bird that isn't just surviving on leftovers. It's thriving on what everyone else literally can't stomach. But to make that work long-term, you need more than strong acid. You need an entire body plan rebuilt around bone. So, you've got this bone-eating specialist with industrial-grade stomach acid and a whole skeleton-centric lifestyle. You might think the look would match the diet. Grim, grisly, maybe permanently stained with dried blood. But what you actually find is kind of fabulous. Let's imagine you're on a cold cliff face in the high mountains, watching one of these birds glide past. The wings are long and narrow, almost like a giant falcon stretched out for soaring instead of sprinting. The tail doesn't fan out like a normal vulture either. It tapers into this sharp, diamond shape that makes the whole bird look more like a massive hunting raptor than a garbage collector. Up close, the body is pale, almost creamy white, with darker wings. The face has this bold black mask running through the eyes, like it's permanently wearing villain eyeliner. And under the beak, a little tuft of dark, bristly feathers that stick out like a goatee. That beard is what gives the bearded vulture its name. And yes, these guys are all real, not some fantasy dragon concept art. But the part your brain really locks onto is the color. Because a lot of adults aren't just white and black. Their chest and belly are washed in this deep orange, almost rusty red, like someone dunked them in paprika. The legs, the underside, sometimes even the neck can glow with this strange, burnt color that looks way too dramatic to be accidental. You might think, okay, cool natural pigment. Some gene went wild and turned the bird into a walking sunset. Well, no. The bearded vulture is basically doing its own feather makeup. It finds iron-rich mud, red mineral springs, and stained rock faces, then deliberately bathes in them. The oxidized iron particles stick to the feathers and dye the white plumage this intense orange. It's not built-in color. It's a stain. So now your bone-eating sky dragon is also running a mountain spa routine. While other vultures are just trying not to freeze or starve, this one is out here doing mud masks. Why? That's the fun part. We don't actually know for sure, but one big hypothesis is status signaling. The best, richest iron baths are rare. If you're a bird that can regularly access them, you end up with a darker, more saturated orange. That might tell other bearded vultures, I know the good spots. I'm strong enough to hold this territory. You should probably date me instead of that pale scrub over there. It could also be cosmetic enhancement tied to mate choice, like a built-in honesty test. You can't fake a good rust job if you're too weak or low rank to reach the mineral springs. See, while we're busy obsessing over bones and guts, the bird itself is quietly telling you it's more than a digestive system with wings. This is the world of a scavenger that redecorates its own body on purpose. And once you realize it's willing to use rocks as tools and mud as makeup, you have to ask, what else is going on inside that bearded vulture brain? So, if the bearded vulture's brain is busy with makeup and rock tools, where does that actually start? High above all those mineral springs, on cliffs that look like a bad idea even for a mountain goat. Let's imagine you're dangling in a harness halfway up a sheer rock wall. You look over, and tucked into a ledge the width of a bookshelf is a huge, messy throne of sticks. That's a bearded vulture nest. These birds don't bother rebuilding from scratch every year. They just keep adding branches, wool, bones, and whatever else they can haul, until the nest becomes this giant, lumpy platform stacked over seasons, sometimes perched hundreds of meters above the valley floor. Inside, the chicks don't look like the elegant, rust-stained adults you've seen in photos. They hatch dark, almost crow-like, with a kind of goth, fluffy intensity. You might think they pop out ready to be bone-eating supervillains, but what you actually find is a very slow makeover. Over several years, the plumage gradually lightens, the face pattern sharpens, and the bird shifts from awkward cliff goblin to sleek mountain dragon. And that glow-up isn't just about feathers. While they're still in the nest, adults bring in a mix of scraps, soft meat, tendons, smaller bones. The chicks start with the easy stuff, tearing at whatever doesn't fight back or bounce away. As they fledge and start flapping out over the abyss, they're watching. Who gets which bones? How high do the adults climb with them? Where do they aim when they let go? See, Bone dropping looks simple until you actually try to do physics at 60 kilometers an hour. Juveniles start with tiny pieces, carrying them in their talons or beaks, then nervously letting them fall onto rocks. Sometimes they nail it. A clean shatter, marrow exposed, snack unlocked, and sometimes total disaster. Researchers have watched young birds misjudge everything. They choose smooth slabs instead of jagged boulders. They drop bones from way too low, so nothing breaks. Or they go too high in weird wind, miss the boneyard completely, and watch their dinner pinball down the slope and vanish. Imagine dropping your entire meal off a balcony and just shrugging and trying again. But that's the point. This isn't a built-in script. It's a multi-year apprenticeship in flying and gravity. They practice different heights, different bone sizes, different angles, slowly learning which combinations actually crack open a cow femur and which just waste energy. And yes, these guys are all real mountain birds running crude physics experiments because evolution outsourced half their hunting strategy to trial and error. By the time a bearded vulture has full adult plumage, it's not just older. It's a specialist that survived years of near misses, broken bones, and botched drops. Which raises the next question. Once you finally smash those bones just right, how on earth do you digest them? Let's imagine you zoom out from that single bone tumbling through the air and look at the whole mountain. Because the bearded vulture's dinner doesn't start with a drop. It starts with something dying. High mountains look empty from far away. Just rock, ice, and cold air. You might think nothing big lives long enough up here to leave much behind. But what you actually find is a constant slow-motion disaster reel. Domestic sheep and cows grazing too close to cliff edges. Wild goats and ibex misjudging a jump by a few centimeters. Chamois swept off slopes by avalanches. Even huge birds slammed into rock by sudden wind. Every fall, every blizzard, every exhausted animal that just can't take one more climb adds another body to the landscape. Not neatly, not predictably. You get these random giant pulses of biomass scattered across the ridges and valleys. One week, nothing. The next, a whole cow wedged in a snow gully like somebody airdropped a buffet. And when that happens, the mountain wakes up. This is the world of carcass ecology. Foxes, wolves, bears if you're in the right range, ravens and other vultures circling like they got a group text, insects boiling out of the ground the second the snow melts, bacteria quietly starting their slow, invisible takeover. And yes, these guys are all real, even if you rarely see more than a feather or a paw print. The sequence is almost ritual. A predator kills something, or a hiker finds a body already half frozen. Big scavengers move in first, tearing out organs and muscle because those are the high-calorie, easy-access parts. Faces get peeled, ribs get opened. The gut pile disappears faster than you want to imagine. Then come the smaller players, trimming off scraps, licking up fat, cleaning out the last soft tissue. What's left looks useless. A skeleton, maybe still wired together with tendon and cartilage, slowly drying in the wind. In the cold, thin air, that thing can sit for months or even years, bleaching in the sun, snowed over, re-exposed. Like a permanent crime scene no one bothers to tape off. Well, no one except the bone specialist. The bearded vulture doesn't rush in with the crowd. It can afford to be late because it's here for the leftover the others literally can't use. It cruises along cliff faces, scanning for those pale, abandoned shapes, then drops down to harvest them like you picking up forgotten snacks after a party. See, that's its niche. The final cleanup crew at the end of the carcass timeline. It turns dead weight into food long after everyone else has given up. But if this bird is quietly erasing the last traces of death, what does that actually do to the health and functioning of the entire mountain ecosystem? And what happens if you remove the last specialist in a chain that starts with a fall and ends with bare rock? So, let's imagine you rewind that carcass timeline one more step. Before the bearded vulture arrives, what's actually sitting on that ledge? Not just some leftovers buffet. It's a biological time bomb. In warm seasons especially, those scraps of cartilage, tendons, and half-stripped bones are basically an Airbnb for bacteria and parasites waiting for their next host. You might think a clean skeleton is harmless, just dry bones in the sun. But what you actually find is that bones and marrow can hang on to pathogens for a long time. Think of things like anthrax spores or bacteria that cause nasty gut diseases. In other parts of the world, vultures are famous for cutting down outbreaks of anthrax and even rabies by deleting carcasses before they rot into pathogen factories. High in the mountains, the bearded vulture is playing that same game, just at the final bony stage. See, once the foxes, wolves, and other vultures are done, they leave behind exactly the stuff that can stick around the longest: dense bones with a smear of connective tissue, dried ligaments, pockets of marrow. Most scavengers can't really use that. Jaws aren't strong enough, guts aren't specialized enough, or it's just not worth the effort. The bearded vulture looks at that and goes, "Perfect. Dinner?" It swallows smaller bones whole and hauls the bigger ones into the air to smash them open, literally finishing the cleanup job everyone else started. That speed matters. The faster those last greasy fragments disappear, the less time pathogens have to multiply, wash into streams, or get sniffed out by some unlucky goat, dog, or human who decides to poke around. In a cold alpine valley with short summers, shaving days or weeks off. How long a carcass lingers can be the difference between a quiet season and a disease hotspot. This is the world of airborne sanitation, and yes, these guys are all real. But the bird isn't just a flying trash compactor. It's also a nutrient recycler with wings. Bones are loaded with calcium, phosphorus, and all kinds of minerals locked away in rock-hard packages. When the bearded vulture digests them with its ultra-acidic stomach, those minerals get turned into bird, feathers, muscles, eggs, all the moving parts. And what doesn't stay in the bird comes back out as droppings, scattered across cliffs, ledges, and distant slopes far from the original carcass. Well, that sounds gross, but it's basically high-quality fertilizer raining onto places that might never see a large animal die there. Plants, lichens, insects, even tiny soil microbes cash in on that nutrient drizzle. Over time, this spreads the energy from one dead animal across an entire valley, instead of letting it rot in one grim little hot spot. So the bearded vulture's bone obsession isn't just a weird evolutionary quirk. It's a mountain-wide service contract. It scrubs away disease risk material, recycles locked-up minerals, and keeps these harsh, rocky ecosystems running smoother than you'd expect. But if one bird is doing all that heavy lifting, what happens when you start quietly removing it from the sky? So, if pulling this one bird out of the sky can scramble an entire mountain system, you have to ask, how did it end up on bones in the first place, when everyone else is obsessed with meat? Let's imagine you're a young scavenger in a cold, high valley. A sheep dies on a cliff. You might think, nice, free buffet. But what you actually find is a full-on brawl. Wolves are lunging, ravens are dive-bombing, maybe a bear lumbers in like it owns the place, and other vultures are already elbow-deep in the good stuff. If you're small, light, and not built like a feathered tank, trying to muscle in here is a really fast way to become part of the carcass. This is the world of ecological arms races. When lots of species want the same resource, you can either fight harder, or you can quietly step sideways into something they can't use. And bones are basically the leftovers of the leftovers. They're hard, dry, low reward, if you don't have the right tools. So most scavengers grab a few scraps of cartilage, crack a couple of easy joints, and then they're gone, chasing the next fresh kill. But the bones stay. Long after the last wolf slinks away and the ravens get bored, you still have a pile of dense, calcium-rich, marrow-stuffed material just sitting there on the rocks. No screaming, no claws, no chaos, just silence and time. For a bird that's willing to wait and then work a little harder, that's not garbage. That's a private pantry. So, imagine a population of mountain vultures where a few weirdos happen to have slightly stronger stomach acid, or a habit of hauling bones off to quieter ledges. They don't win the big meat fights, but they also don't get injured as often, and they can eat on days when everyone else struck out. Natural selection loves that kind of side hustle. Over generations, the acid gets stronger, the gut lining tougher, the behavior more precise. What started as, "I guess I'll nibble the leftovers" snowballs into, "I can swallow a 25-centimeter bone like a noodle and actually digest it." And once you're really good at bones, the whole body starts to follow. See, if your main food is rock hard and shaped like a club, your beak, neck muscles, even how you carry things in flight, all come under pressure to adapt. Stronger grip, better control, smarter choices about which bones are worth the effort. The birds that pick the right rocks to drop them on, from the right height, walk away with more calories. But if evolution can push a vulture this far into the bone niche, what else has it quietly rewritten? Just how many parts of its body and behavior are now secretly optimized for a lifestyle that looks impossible from the outside? So if the whole body has been quietly reprogrammed for bones, you'd expect the head to look a little off. And when you finally get a close look at a bearded vulture's face, you realize evolution didn't just tweak a few things. It redesigned the entire front end like a flying surgical tool. Let's imagine you're gliding alongside one at eye level. You might think you're looking at some kind of hawk stretched in a funhouse mirror, but what you actually find is this long, narrow, almost torpedo-shaped head. It's slimmer than most vultures, more like a streamlined falcon, which cuts down air resistance on those huge, hours-long mountain flights and lets the bird twist and tilt the beak with ridiculous precision when it's lining up a bone in midair. That beak is not just for show. It's sharply hooked at the tip, like a built-in crowbar, but the sides are surprisingly neat and narrow, perfect for gripping long, greasy fragments without losing them. Now look just under the chin. See that little black tuft? That's the beard that gave the bird its name. It's not some emo fashion statement. Those stiff bristles act like a scrub brush and splash guard, helping protect the skin and keep the area around the mouth a bit cleaner while the bird is wrestling with marrow-soaked bones. Then there are the eyes. This is where the face goes from oddly specialized to mythic dragon that definitely knows your search history. The irises burn red or orange, ringed in dark, almost mask-like markings that make the stare look even more intense. It's not just for intimidation. From hundreds of meters up, those eyes are picking out pale bones against rock, tracking how they bounce, and scanning for flat, safe drop zones in a maze of cliffs where one bad throw is a broken leg. Get closer, and the safety gear becomes obvious. The feathers around the eyes and face are short, bristly, and dense, like built-in goggles and a dust mask. When the bird leans into a shattered bone pile, those little feathers help block splinters, dust, and rancid debris from hitting the eyeball or clogging the nostrils. And yes, these guys are all real. This isn't a fantasy creature loadout. It's just what you get when your job is basically high-speed bone shrapnel tester. So this isn't just a scary face pasted onto a normal vulture. It's a precision instrument. The narrow skull slices through cold air, the hooked beak and beard grip, and manage slippery bones. The fire-bright eyes and their armor pick targets and stay safe. All of it is tuned to locate, grab, and process the toughest leftovers in the mountains. Which raises a bigger question. What kind of internal hardware do you need to actually melt stone-hard bone once it's inside? So, once you've built a skull that can turn cow femurs into snacks, you still have a huge problem. How do you actually find enough bones in a landscape where carcasses are rare, scattered, and usually halfway up a cliff? You solve it with wings that are basically patience made visible. Let's imagine you're standing on a ridge and one of these birds suddenly slides past you. Up close, the bearded vulture is giant. Long, broad wings stretch nearly 3 meters across, and that weird diamond-shaped tail sticks out like a built-in steering wheel. You might think a bone-eater would need fast, frantic flapping to chase down food, but what you actually find is the opposite. A bird that hardly flaps at all. See, this is the world of mountain air, and the bearded vulture is playing it like a video game it has already beaten. Those long wings lock in place, the tail tilts a few degrees, and the bird just hangs there in invisible elevators of air called thermals. Warm air rises from sun-baked slopes, cold air spills down gullies, and the vulture rides the boundaries between them, trading altitude for distance without burning much fuel. Then there's ridge lift. Wind slams into a cliff, gets forced upward, and suddenly the entire mountain turns into a conveyor belt. The bird cruises along these edges, tracing knife-like ridgelines and deep valleys, scanning for the tiniest signal of death. A patch of fur, a cluster of ravens, a flash of white bone on dark rock. Hours can go by with almost no flapping. It's basically gliding its way through a buffet where the dishes are miles apart. And that's critical because bone is this weird combination of jackpot and drought. It's insanely calorie-dense, packed with fat-rich marrow, but it's also patchy. One dead ibex can feed you for days, if you can find it. The energy economics here are brutal. If you had to flap like a crow across a territory the size of a small country, you'd starve long before you sniffed out enough skeletons. So the bearded vulture does the opposite. It spreads that huge wing surface, keeps its metabolic costs low, and accepts that dinner might be on the next mountain range. Or the one after that. They'll casually travel dozens of kilometers between feeding sites, crossing empty valleys other scavengers never bother with, because walking there would be a nightmare, and even most birds won't risk the commute. And yes, these guys are all real. This willingness to roam means almost no direct competition. By the time a bearded vulture drops in, the meat party is over, the guests are gone, and the bones are cold and waiting. But that same energy-efficient, long-distance lifestyle comes with a modern twist. When your survival depends on trusting whatever carcass the mountains give you, it only takes one poisoned body to kill you, for reasons that have nothing to do with predators, hunger, or even bones at all. So, here's the plot twist you didn't see coming. Bones aren't just nature's snack packs of calcium and fat. They're also storage lockers for whatever toxic garbage an animal has picked up over its entire life. You might think skeletons are basically clean once the meat is gone, right? Just dry, white, harmless leftovers. But what you actually find, if you zoom in chemically, is that bones act like long-term hard drives for heavy metals. Lead, for example, doesn't just float around in the blood forever. The body tries to get it out of circulation, so it quietly tucks it away in bone, where it can sit for years or even decades. Now, let's imagine a mountain valley after hunting season. A deer gets shot with lead ammunition, runs off, and dies somewhere nobody bothers to look. The bullet doesn't stay in one neat piece. It shatters into tiny fragments, microscopic metal shrapnel that ends up lodged in tissue and, over time, locked into the bones themselves. Add in other pollutants from industry and old poisons, and you've basically turned that skeleton into a crunchy, toxic time capsule. For a fox, that might not be a huge deal, because it's mostly tearing into the meat. But a bearded vulture. This is the world of the animal that shows up late, ignores the flesh, and goes straight for the skeleton like it's the main course. It picks up a femur that looks perfectly normal, carries it into the cold, thin air, smashes it on the rocks, and then swallows the shards whole, along with every invisible lead fragment baked inside. See, that ultra-acidic stomach that can melt a cow bone is also really good at dissolving metal into the bloodstream. So a bird that evolved to be a bone specialist is now the perfect machine for extracting every last molecule of poison humans left behind. One contaminated carcass isn't just a bad meal, it can be a lethal dose. And once that lead is in the system, things go downhill fast. Lead targets the nervous system, so you start to see weird, tragic behavior. Birds that seem confused, that can't coordinate their wings properly, that get tired after short flights when they're supposed to be cruising across entire mountain ranges. They may crash into cliffs, miss landings, or just sit grounded, too weak to take off. By the time anyone finds them, if anyone finds them, it's usually far from the original poisoned carcass, with no obvious clue that the killer was a tiny fragment of metal they never even saw. Well, that's the dark irony here. The adaptation that made the bearded vulture so successful for millions of years, living almost entirely on bones, now turns it into a magnet for our invisible pollutants. But bones aren't the only thing humans have quietly weaponized against them. So, if eating poisoned bones is the invisible threat, the visible one was much cruder. People just tried to erase the bird itself. Let's imagine you're a shepherd in the Alps 200 years ago. You look up and see a giant, rusty orange vulture circling above your flock, wings wider than you are tall, red eyes, dagger of a beak, trailing a bone in its claws. You might think, yeah, that thing is 100% here for my lambs, or my kids. But what you actually find, if you follow one, is a bird that almost never kills healthy large animals. It's waiting for something to die first. Still, for centuries across European mountain ranges, bearded vultures, lammergeiers, literally lamb killers, were blamed for just about everything. Missing lamb? Lammergeier. Goat slips on ice. Lammergeier. Child falls off a cliff. Somehow, lammergeier again. And yes, these guys are all real. Priests writing sermons about them. Naturalists repeating rumors of them carrying off babies. Hunters swearing they'd seen one drop a tortoise on a man's head. The bird that actually eats bones got turned into a flying horror story because it looked like one. Huge wings, black beard, always hanging around carcasses and cliffs. It was basically typecast as the villain. See, once a species gets a reputation like that, the details don't matter. People in the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Balkans, all knew lammergeiers were dangerous, so they didn't wait for proof. They set out poison baits, shot any bird in range, and climbed to nests to smash eggs or kill chicks. This wasn't the occasional angry farmer. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was organized campaigns, with bounties paid per beak or pair of feet. You might think a bird that lives on cliffs, in storms, in some of the coldest, harshest terrain in Europe would be hard to wipe out. But bones don't protect you from bullets. One poisoned carcass can kill several scavengers at once. A single nest destroyed means years of effort gone, because bearded vultures raise very few chicks. Population math starts collapsing fast. By the early 20th century, the lamb killer had been hunted to local extinction in the Alps. The same mountains it had cleaned for thousands of years suddenly went quiet of that shadowy, bone-carrying silhouette. This is the world of human-made ghost stories. We invent the monster, then we kill the real animal that inspired it. And the irony? The bird people feared as a kid snatcher was actually a sanitation worker with wings, cleaning up the last scraps of carcasses that even other vultures leave behind. But fear is louder than ecology. For a while, it really looked like the Alps had lost their bone-eating specialist for good. No nests, no circling shapes over high passes, just old bounty posters and stories. Well, that should have been the end of the lammergeier in much of Europe. Except, the mountains weren't quite finished with their ghost. In the next part, a very quiet, very unlikely comeback begins. So, the ghost comes back, in an incubator. Let's imagine you're in a quiet breeding center in the Alps in the 1980s. No roaring crowds, no dramatic release music, just a row of huge eggs under warm lamps. You might think saving a vulture is all about rescuing injured birds and patching up wings. But what you actually find is way slower and way stranger. People trying to rebuild an entire lost behavior from scratch. Conservation groups from several countries basically formed an international bone-eater committee. Zoos and specialized centers paired up bearded vultures from the last strongholds in places like Spain and captive lines, trying to get them to breed. Every chick was a tiny screaming investment in the idea that the Alps didn't have to stay empty forever. But you can't just hand-raise a lammergeier like a parrot and hope for the best. If they imprint on humans, you don't get a wild scavenger. You get a 3-meter wingspan weirdo that thinks hikers are its parents. So keepers fed chicks with puppets, hid behind screens, and kept voices low. The whole vibe was, yes, we're helping you, but please don't remember our faces. When juveniles were old enough, they were carried, literally in crates, up to remote cliff ledges, fitted with tiny transmitters, and left in release niches that mimicked natural nest sites. See, the idea wasn't to fling them into the sky and hope. They had to sit, watch wild ravens and eagles, test their wings, and slowly decide, on their own schedule, that gravity was optional. And then reality hit. Some birds struggled to find enough carcasses in modern, cleaned-up mountain pastures. Others collided with power lines because no one told them that invisible cables slice through airspace now. A few simply vanished off the map. Depressing? Yes. Useless? Not at all. Each failure was data. Teams started mapping safe flight corridors, marking or burying dangerous lines, and working with farmers to leave more carcasses out instead of removing everything. Release ages were tweaked. Sites were moved. It turned into this giant, decades-long trial-and-error experiment where the stakes were actual lives, and then, quietly, the payoff. Transmitters showed birds carving out territories across multiple valleys. Pairs formed. Nests appeared on cliffs that hadn't seen that silhouette in half a century. The real milestone wasn't just a released bird surviving. It was wild-hatched chicks stepping out, opening those huge wings, and taking their first shaky flights over ski resorts and hiking trails that had forgotten them. And yes, these guys are all real, not CGI extras. Today, dozens of breeding pairs patrol the Alps, with territories slowly spreading into neighboring ranges. This isn't just a feel-good, save the fluffy animal story. It's the mountains getting a missing organ back. Because when a bone specialist returns, the nutrient cycle changes. Bones that would sit and slowly rot, or get scattered by foxes, are now ground down into flying calcium, dropped, digested, and redeposited. Other scavengers shift their timing. Disease risk drops. This is the world of ecological restoration, where the goal isn't just more birds in the sky, but a cleaner, tighter recycling system for the whole high-altitude community. And once you've rebuilt a bone eater, the next question is brutal. Can you keep it alive in a modern landscape that's still trying to poison it? So once you've dodged the poisons and power lines, you hit the weirdest conservation problem of all. How do you teach a bird to drop bones from the sky when it's never seen anyone do it? You might think you just show it a YouTube tutorial, but bone-eating vultures don't grow up with parents giving TED Talks. In the wild, juveniles shadow adults, watching them haul giant leg bones into the air and smash them on special rock slabs called ossuaries. Captive-bred birds don't get that. No seasoned lammergeier is out there doing live demos in the aviary. So scientists are stuck with this uncomfortable question: is bone dropping a hardwired instinct, or is it a cultural trick that dies out if nobody performs it in front of you? Well, when you actually follow released juveniles, you see something really interesting. They don't immediately start hurling cow farmers off cliffs like tiny demolition experts. At first, they go for the easy stuff: scraps of meat, small carcasses, bits of cartilage, and little bones they can just swallow whole. It's like watching a teenager live off snacks because cooking looks scary. Then, slowly, curiosity kicks in. Let's imagine you're one of these young birds. You find a bigger bone, too thick to swallow. You pick it up, flap awkwardly, maybe fly a short distance, and drop it from a low height. It just thuds. No satisfying shatter. So you try again, a bit higher, maybe over rougher rock. Tiny chips fly off. Feedback. Your brain goes, that worked better. Tracking studies and field cameras catch this whole learning arc in real time. At first, GPS tags show juveniles wandering all over the mountains, basically speed-running a map of every rocky slope in their territory. But what you actually find, after months, is that their movements start clustering around specific ledges and boulder fields. Those become their personal ossuaries, the crash test sites where they refine their drop angles, heights, and targets for years. See, nobody is standing there, grading them. No adult swoops in like, actually, that's the wrong rock type. The environment itself is the teacher. If you drop bones badly, you waste energy and stay hungry. If you dial in the technique, you get a rush of fatty marrow. That reward loop is so strong that the behavior self-assembles as long as the basic instincts are in place. Pick up the bone, fly with it, and be weirdly obsessed with smashing it. And yes, these guys are all real. Different mountain ranges, different reintroduction projects, same gravity-powered solution emerging again and again, even from birds raised by humans. This is the world of a lifestyle so deeply wired that culture is optional. But if instinct can rebuild bone dropping from scratch, what happens when the landscape itself starts changing under their wings? So, while the bearded vulture is up there rehearsing its next bone drop, everyone else is already at the buffet. You might think a carcass in the mountains is just a free-for-all food fight, but what you actually find is this weirdly organized, high-altitude cafeteria line. Let's imagine a sheep dies on a rocky slope. The first shadows that drop out of the cold sky are usually griffin vultures. Big, pale, classic vulture. Silhouette. They are all about soft tissue, guts, muscle, anything you'd normally call meat. They hit the carcass hard and fast, strip off the skin, open the body cavity, and turn a whole animal into a loose skeleton in what feels like minutes. And yes, these guys are all real. It's basically a feathered demolition crew. On the ground, ravens are already there, acting like the loud neighbor who shows up early and never leaves. They dart in for scraps, eyes, tongue, little bits the big vultures miss. Foxes and other mammals work the edges too, hauling off hunks of flesh when they can, caching pieces for later. If you froze the scene right now, it would look like the bearded vulture's worst nightmare. No privacy, no bones to drop, just chaos. But watch what happens over the next few hours. The griffins get full and peel away. The fox drags off whatever it can carry. The ravens thin out. What's left is the stuff nobody else really wants: dried tendons, cartilage, and those huge, heavy bones that are basically edible rocks to most animals. This is the world of the late-stage scavenger. That's when the bearded vulture finally comes in. It isn't late because it's lazy. It's late because its entire strategy is built around everyone else going first. Temporal partitioning sounds fancy, but it just means different species are using the same carcass at different times, like shifts on a 24-hour diner. Dietary partitioning is the same idea with menu choices. Griffins take meat, foxes grab scraps, ravens pick at anything, and the lammergeier calmly claims the skeleton. See? That division of labor is what lets all these scavengers actually coexist on the same mountains without constant war. Each one is specializing in a different stage of decomposition, from fresh kill to sun-bleached bones. The bearded vulture's niche is so bizarre that by the time it lands, the crowd has usually moved on. It rarely has to fight, because almost nobody else is trying to swallow a 25-centimeter leg bone whole. But if one bird can push its diet all the way into living on bones, what other animals have gone just as far in other directions? Who else is out there eating what should be impossible food? And how did their bodies keep up with those choices? So, why doesn't every scavenger just copy this and turn into a walking bone shredder? You might think, free food on every carcass. Just eat the leftovers. But what you actually find is that bones are kind of a nightmare engineering problem. Let's imagine you're designing an animal whose main course is skeleton. First, you need insane mechanical power to break those bones open. Not just a strong bite, but the ability to either crush dense leg bones or drop them from the sky without shattering your own face, neck, or wings. Then you need safe handling, because sharp splinters can stab your gut from the inside. And on top of that, you need chemical power, stomach acid strong enough to dissolve what is basically a rock made of calcium. Most bone eaters tap out way before that. Hyenas, for example, have jaws that can crack a wildebeest femur like it's a breadstick. Wolves will chew ribs and vertebrae until they snap. But watch what they actually do at a kill. They rip into the flesh first, gorge on organs and muscle, and only then start crunching bones as a high-calorie supplement. Bone is dessert, not the main dish. See, meat is easy mode. It tears, it rots fast, and you can digest it without turning your stomach into an acid volcano. Bones are the hard mode that almost no one bothers to unlock. Many animals just don't have the combo package you'd need: ultra-strong acid, reinforced stomach lining, and a gut that can keep grinding away at mineralized tissue for hours without wearing itself out. And even if your chemistry is good, your plumbing has to survive. Swallowing a 25-centimeter shard of cow leg is great for YouTube views, but if it punctures your intestine, that's game over. Most species are stuck with soft guts that work beautifully on meat and plants, but would be absolutely wrecked by razor-edged bone fragments. Evolution also has this annoying rule. You can't skip straight to bone specialist. You have to pass through messy intermediate stages where you're only kind of good at it. That means you're taking in heavy, hard-to-digest chunks that might not give you much energy back while still risking broken teeth, jaw damage, or internal injuries. If the payoff isn't huge at every step, natural selection just slams the brakes. The bearded vulture is one of the rare cases where everything lined up. High mountains with lots of dead herbivores, crowds of other scavengers stripping away the easy meat, cold, thin air where soaring is cheap, but chasing live prey is expensive, and a lineage that slowly ratcheted up its stomach acid, bone-dropping behavior, and gut armor until, somehow, living on bones stopped being a terrible idea and became a winning strategy. This is the world of extreme diets, where a few lineages push one food source to the absolute limit. So if one bird can go all in on skeletons, who else has taken an everyday food and turned it into something monstrous? So, let's imagine you follow this bone-obsessed bird up into its world. The air gets thin, the wind gets loud, and suddenly every wing beat feels expensive. At 4,000 meters up. The sky looks empty, but it's actually a brutal economy of oxygen and energy. You might think flying is just flap harder, go higher. But what you actually find in high mountains is that the rules change. The air is cold and light. Oxygen levels are lower. For a big bird with giant wings, every climb takes more effort. Every glide has to count, and every wasted calorie is a bad life choice. Now drop a scavenger into that. Carcasses are scattered, cliffs are everywhere, and storms can pin you down for days. You can't afford to be a picky eater. But if you can tap into the one part of a carcass almost nobody else wants, that's like finding a secret battery pack in the sky. See, bone marrow is basically nature's power bar. It's fat-rich, energy-dense, and wrapped in a hard calcium shell that works like a built-in lunchbox. For a soaring bird, fat is gold because gram for gram, it gives you way more energy than muscle. Long-distance glides, steep climbs back up from a valley, fighting headwinds at low oxygen. That's the stuff marrow is made for. And yes, these guys are all real. Bearded vultures cruising over the Alps, the Himalaya, the Ethiopian highlands, calmly hauling leg bones bigger than your forearm. They're not just being dramatic. They're cashing in on high-calorie packages that other scavengers either can't crack or can't digest. But bones aren't just batteries. They're mineral bars. A bird that spends its life smashing into icy updrafts, banking hard around rock faces, and landing on jagged ledges needs a skeleton that doesn't snap the first time it misjudges a gust. Calcium and phosphorus from all that bone help keep their own bones, and those thick, heavy eggshells strong in a place where nests get hammered by cold, wind, and gravity. Well, does altitude magically create bone eaters? Not really. You don't see every mountain vulture turning into a skeleton addict. Instead, you get this weird cocktail. Lots of dead animals from falls, avalanches, and harsh winters, intense competition for soft meat, and a landscape that rewards any bird that can ride huge distances on minimal fuel. Put those together, and a bone-based diet stops looking like a party trick and starts looking like a survival algorithm. This is the world of extreme adaptations, where evolution doesn't flip one magic switch. It stacks pressures: thin air, scattered food, competition, cold, long flights, and somewhere in that pile, a bird that can live almost entirely on bones stops being impossible and starts being inevitable. So, if altitude isn't the whole story, what other strange choices did this bird make to double down on bones? So, if altitude isn't the whole story, you have to ask, where does a bone eater actually go to turn a solid cow femur into something it can swallow? It doesn't just wing it over a random cliff and hope for the best. It has a plan, a place, its own private demolition site. Let's imagine you're following one bearded vulture through the mountains. It grabs a huge leg bone, hauls it into the cold air, and starts circling not over the carcass, not over a nest, but over one specific patch of rock it clearly knows by heart. That patch is what biologists call an ossuary. In this context, it's not some spooky human crypt. It's a favorite rocky outcrop or cliff shelf where the bird repeatedly drops bones to shatter them. You might think the whole mountain is just one big rock, so why be picky? But what you actually find is that these birds are absurdly choosy. The good ossuaries are usually hard, bare slabs with a steep drop and a clear approach path, so the bird can dive in, let go at 50 or 80 meters, and watch gravity do the dirty work. Softer scree or grassy slopes? Terrible. Bones just bounce or disappear. Bad for dinner. Over time, this turns into something really weird. The ground at a successful ossuary starts filling up with shards. Old femurs, shattered vertebrae, splintered ribs. A whole archaeological layer of past lunches. You can walk up to some of these spots and instantly know where you are. No carcass in sight, just a boneyard in the sky's shadow that birds come back to again and again. And it's not just one individual with a favorite table. Some ossuaries are reused by multiple birds, sometimes for decades. Parents bring young there, juveniles watch the drops, fail a bunch, and eventually copy the technique. That suggests the location isn't just discovered, it's remembered and passed on. You're basically looking at a cultural landmark, written in calcium. See, this is where the physics nerd in the bearded vulture really starts showing. Rock type changes how much energy goes into the bone versus the ground. Angle and slope change whether fragments scatter or stay put. Wind exposure messes with the drop trajectory. And yet, the birds keep picking places where the smash success rate is high, as if they've run 1,000 messy experiments and locked in the optimal setting. At this point, you're not just watching an animal forage. You're watching something that looks suspiciously like tool use without a handheld tool, and a kind of site engineering without blueprints. The mountain becomes part of the vulture's body plan. The cliff is its external jaw. And yes, these guys are all real. But smashing bones is only half the magic trick. Once those shards go down the hatch, something even stranger has to happen next. How do you turn rock-hard bone into actual fuel? So, once those bones explode on the rocks, you're not just watching dinner prep. You're watching a physics lab with feathers. Because the bearded vulture isn't just dropping and hoping, it's dropping, checking, and then changing the plan. Let's imagine you're sitting on a ridge, freezing, watching one of these birds at work. First drop, the leg bone hits, bounces, doesn't crack. The bird circles back, grabs the same bone, and climbs higher. Second drop, better, a few splinters. Third drop, it shifts a few meters sideways to a sharper, darker rock and aims again. You might think that's random, but what you actually find, if you watch long enough, is a pattern. See, after a bad break, the vulture doesn't just give up or keep repeating the same move. It tweaks the height, or the angle, or the exact spot on the ossuary. Too low? Go higher. Bone slid off a rounded boulder? Try the jagged slab next to it. That's trial and error with memory attached, not just instinct on autopilot. Over time, those experiments add up. Adults are weirdly loyal to certain boneyards, flying straight to the same outcrops over and over, like regulars at a very violent restaurant. That suggests they're building mental maps of the landscape. This ridge for big cow femurs, that ledge for smaller goat bones, this wind direction gives you the cleanest drop. They're not just remembering rocks good. They're remembering which rocks, and from which approach, actually work. And while we can't say they understand physics the way you'd calculate a trajectory, they behave like they've internalized some very specific rules. Higher means a harder hit. Flatter rocks spread the force, sharp ones focus it. Dry, solid stone breaks bones. Soft ground just eats the impact. It's a practical grasp of height, angle, and surface that would make a high school physics teacher suspicious. This is the world of animal problem solving, and the vulture is not alone. Crows drop nuts onto roads so cars crack them open, then wait for the traffic light like tiny, feathery traffic engineers. Sea otters lie on their backs with a rock on their chest, hammering shells like they're running a cold, salty workshop. And yes, these guys are all real. Bearded vultures just take the same idea and scale it up to giant bones and mountain-sized anvils. Well, once you see it that way, the bird stops looking like a flying stomach and more like a researcher with wings. Each failed drop is data. Each successful shatter is a result worth repeating. It's constantly refining one extremely specific interaction. Bone, gravity, stone. But smashing is only the start. The really weird part is what happens after those shards finally make it into that supercharged gut. So, if the ossuary is the lab bench, you're about to see the field site. Take that same bone-smashing scientist with wings and drop it into one of the hardest places on Earth to even stay alive, the high Himalaya. Let's imagine you're standing at 4,500 meters, lungs burning, fingers going numb in the thin, cold air. Below you, yak herds crawl along the slope like hairy tanks. Blue sheep cling to cliffs that look physically allergic to flat ground, and every so often, something slips, falls, or just doesn't wake up after a blizzard. You might think that in a place this remote, a carcass would just freeze into a permanent ice sculpture, but what you actually find is a cleanup crew that's been doing extreme waste management for thousands of years. Bearded vultures in the Himalaya shadow both worlds, wild and domestic. They trail transhuman herders, those families moving yak and goats up and down the mountains with the seasons, and they also track the migrations of blue sheep and other wild ungulates. To you, that's just a shifting landscape of snow and rock. To them, it's a moving calendar of where bones are statistically likely to appear. The birds remember which passes see the most avalanches, which summer meadows host the biggest herds, and which villages leave carcasses on specific ridges because digging graves in permafrost is basically impossible. See, this is the world of high-altitude bone economics. Field biologists have watched bearded vultures commute, very deliberately, from a yak carcass miles away to a favorite cliff ledge or glacial moraine. These spots become real ossuaries, sloping fans of shattered bone at the base of sheer rock. And yes, these guys are all real, carrying yak leg bones that look almost comically oversized in their talons, like a crow trying to fly off with a baseball bat. They spiral up, stall, and let gravity do the punchline. From below, you hear the crack echo off the valley walls. Shards skitter over blue ice and dark stone, while the bird loops around for another pass. It's the same behavior you saw earlier, but now the stakes are higher, literally. Miss the rock here, and that bone might vanish into a crevasse or slide half a kilometer down a glacier. So the bird has to be good at reading not just bones, but landscapes. And the humans watching? They're not always shooing it away. In parts of the Himalaya, people see these vultures as cleaners, even as sacred helpers that take what can't easily be buried or burned and return it to the sky. When you live where wood is scarce, soil is frozen, and winter kills fast, a bird that erases remains is less a horror movie extra and more a public service. You might think this bone-eating lifestyle was just some bizarre European mountain quirk, but up here you see it's a full global strategy. Different cultures, different mammals, same weird solution. Turn the hardest, most useless leftovers into fuel. And if it can work from the Pyrenees to the Himalaya, what does that say about how far a stomach and some gravity can really go? So, you've got this bird that can read cliffs like a map and bones like a menu. You might think that level of aerial IQ would keep it out of trouble. But what you actually find is that the bearded vulture is flying through a brand new maze it was never programmed for. Let's imagine you're riding along on its back. You're skimming right along a ridge, just a few meters above the rocks, or gliding across a huge valley at shoulder height to the mountains. That's prime bearded vulture territory, because from up here you can scan every slope for carcasses, every pale stick of bone that might be worth dropping. It feels wide open, clean, empty. Except it isn't empty anymore. Stretching across those same ridges are power lines, ski lift cables, support wires, random bits of human hardware that basically amount to invisible tripwires in the sky. These birds love flying at exactly the height where we like to string things between one mountain and the next. Perfect overlap. Terrible combo. And here's the catch. Their eyes are locked on the ground. They're tuned to spot a sheep femur against snow, not a thin gray cable against a bright sky. When your whole job is scanning down for food, you're not expecting a steel line to suddenly appear at beak level. It's like texting while walking, except the text is, "Where's the next bone?" and the lamppost is moving at 60 kilometers an hour toward you. Collisions really happen. Power lines and lift cables have killed or badly injured bearded vultures in Europe and Asia, and each hit is a huge deal because this is not a species that can just crank out replacements. They lay one egg, maybe two, and usually only one chick survives. Lose a single adult, and you're not just down one bird, you're down decades of potential bone recycling. Well, humans did at least notice we were booby-trapping their highways, so conservationists are trying to hack the system, marking lines with bright flappers or spirals so they stand out against the sky, burying cables where possible, rerouting new power lines and ski lifts away from key flight corridors and nesting cliffs, so you don't run a wire right through the middle of a traditional bone-dropping site. Pattern interrupt. Imagine designing a wind turbine, but your main stakeholder is a bird that eats skeletons. Wind farms are the next boss level. Big spinning blades planted right where the wind is best. Ridges, passes, valley mouths. Exactly where bearded vultures ride updrafts, carrying heavy bones to drop. A tired bird hauling a giant leg bone into a strong headwind is not in peak reaction mode when a blade appears. See? This is the world of a specialist colliding with general chaos. A bird evolved to read rocks, wind, and bones now has to navigate an overlay of wires and turbines it can't see, can't predict, and definitely didn't sign up for. The question is, can we redraw that overlay fast enough that this bone-eating experiment doesn't end with a thud against our infrastructure? So, if a bearded vulture smashes a femur on a rock and no one's around to see it, does it still tell on the bird? For scientists, The answer is yes. Every shattered shard is basically a crime scene photo from last night's dinner. Let's imagine you hike up to one of their favorite boneyards, these rocky outcrops called ossuaries. You might think you'd just find random debris from whatever died nearby, but what you actually find is weirdly organized chaos. Piles of big limb bones, lots of medium fragments, almost no tiny splinters. Most are from goats, sheep, or wild ungulates, and the breakage isn't from teeth. It's from impact. Clean, angled fractures, like someone's been dropping them from a giant, very rude balcony. See? Those patterns are a signature. A wolf leaves gnaw marks. A human leaves saws cuts. A bearded vulture leaves high-energy shatter lines and a suspicious shortage of marrow. By cataloging bone sizes, species, and how they're cracked, researchers can tell which ossuaries are still active, how often they're used, and even whether juveniles are practicing or experts are feeding. It's like reading a guest book written in collagen. But the real plot twist comes when you pair those bones with tech. Many bearded vultures now carry tiny GPS backpacks, pinging their location every few minutes. So you get this glowing map of flight paths, tight spirals over carcasses, long cold glides along ridges, direct lines to known ossuaries. Match that with where bone piles are building up, and suddenly you're looking at territories, preferred routes, and the exact cliffs that function as bone-smashing restaurants. You might think that's already overkill, but scientists go even deeper, straight into the chemistry. Take a bone fragment from an ossuary or a feather from a captured bird, and you can run isotope analysis on it. Ratios of carbon, nitrogen, even strontium quietly report what kinds of animals the vulture's been eating and how far those prey were roaming. If the signatures scream domestic livestock from low valleys one week and wild ibex from high peaks the next, you can literally track how far this bone addict commutes between meals. And yes, these guys are all real data points. When you stack the clues, bone patterns, GPS routes, isotope fingerprints, you get a living heat map of where bearded vultures thrive and where they're skating on thin ice. Conservationists can flag critical feeding cliffs, migration corridors, and the exact valleys where poisoning or power line collisions are most likely to wipe out a whole local population in one bad season. Well, that's the twist. Every smashed tibia is not just dinner, it's surveillance. This is the world of a bone-based lifestyle being tracked in real time as the mountains change around it. But if we can read the bones this well, what do they tell us about whether this experiment is actually working or quietly starting to fail? Macham. So now that you've met this bird that treats skeletons like an all-you-can-eat buffet, you have to wonder, could evolution do this trick again? Could we get a whole cast of bone addicts roaming other places? Or is the bearded vulture basically a one-off glitch? Let's rewind what had to line up in the mountains. First, you need huge carcasses showing up often enough that there's always a leftover skeleton. Wild sheep, goats, deer, sometimes cows. Second, you need brutal competition for the good stuff. Meat gets stripped fast by wolves, foxes, other vultures. By the time our bird shows up, the buffet is cold, picked clean, and basically useless to everyone else. And third, you need a relatively safe way to grab those bones without getting your face bitten off. Up high on cliffs, with rock plates to smash dinner on, the bearded vulture hits all three. So, let's imagine other places where bones pile up and get weirdly underused. On arid savannas, scavengers shred meat in minutes, but big leg bones can just sit there, sun-bleached, for months. In polar regions, frozen carcasses and skeletons can be locked in ice for years, like a walk-in freezer no one fully empties. And deep in the ocean, When a whale dies and sinks, you get whale falls. Entire ecosystems built around a single skeleton slowly rotting on the seafloor. You might think land is where evolution would go wild with bone specialists, but what you actually find is that the ocean stole most of the good ideas. At whale falls, you get bone-eating worms called osedacs that literally dissolve bone with acid and let their symbiotic bacteria suck out the energy. Crabs, snails, and fish nibble cartilage, marrow, and scraps. And yes, these guys are all real. Some fish and invertebrates can handle bone or bone fragments as a serious part of their diet. But on land? No other vertebrate we know of has gone as far into the bone-only lifestyle as the bearded vulture. Why not? Because the entry fee is brutal. You need stomach acid strong enough to turn dense bone into soup without melting your own gut. You need a body that can handle massive loads of minerals and the heavy metals that quietly accumulate in skeletons over a lifetime. Lead, mercury, all the stuff we leave in ecosystems? That tends to end up in bones. You're not just eating dinner. You're eating everyone's pollution report. See, the bearded vulture is basically a proof of concept. It shows that, under the right pressure cooker of competition, carcass size, and safety, evolution can flip the script and turn the hardest, least appealing part of a body into the foundation of an entire lifestyle. So the real question isn't, could this happen again? But what happens to this one experiment if we keep changing the rules it depends on next? So if this bird is an evolutionary experiment, what does the actual experiment look like, step by step? Let's imagine you're trying to live on bones in a cold mountain range with almost no backup plan. You've got 3 giant problems. You have to find bones, you have to crack them into swallowable chunks, and you have to melt that rock-hard calcium safely inside your own body. You might think the hardest part is the chemistry, but what you actually find is that none of this works unless you start in the sky. Bearded vultures are built for cheap, efficient soaring. Long, narrow wings, light bodies, and that habit of riding every thermal like it's free Uber. They can search hundreds of square kilometers without burning through their own fuel, scanning the ground with ridiculous visual acuity for the pale shapes of carcasses and scattered skeletons. When something dead finally shows up, they don't dive straight into the meat pile. Other vultures, ravens, even big carnivores usually get first crack. The bearded vulture hangs back, or comes in late, because its prize isn't the soft stuff. It's watching which bones are left, which ones are big enough to be worth the risk, but not so huge they're impossible to move. A cow femur? Perfect. A tiny rib? Not worth the effort. Then comes the transport problem. You're a bird trying to fly with a bone that can be up to 1/4 of your own body length. That's where grip strength and wing power kick in. They clamp that bone in their talons and haul it up into the air, sometimes hundreds of meters, toward a favorite crash site, an ossuary. See, this is the world of bone eaters, so they don't just drop food anywhere. They learn specific rocky outcrops where the angle, hardness, and lack of vegetation give them the best shatter. And yes, these guys are all real birds, not tiny flying geologists. But they behave like they're testing rock mechanics. They'll drop the same bone again and again, adjusting height and position until it explodes into smaller shards. That's learned behavior layered on top of anatomy. A young bird has the wings and the claws, but without practice, its dinner just keeps bouncing. Once a piece is finally the right size, they swallow it whole. No chewing, no dainty nibbling, just gone. Now the last adaptation takes over. An insanely acidic stomach, with pH around 1, hot enough and strong enough to dissolve dense cortical bone and expose the fatty marrow inside. Specialized enzymes and a long gut then pull out calcium, phosphorus, and energy-rich lipids, and push out almost nothing but dust. So, what happens if you pull out any one link? Take away the ultra-strong acid, and the shards just sit there. Remove the drop behavior or the ossuaries, and most bones stay too big to swallow. Kill the soaring efficiency, and you can't afford to search until you find them. Does a bone-based lifestyle still work, or does the whole strategy quietly collapse? So, evolution built this insanely tight system where every link matters, but it also quietly hid a trap inside the one thing this bird trusts the most: bone. You might think bones are the safest part of a carcass. All the nasty stuff is in the squishy bits, right? But what you actually find is that bone is like a long-term hard drive for chemicals. Anything a cow, sheep, or goat was dosed with can get locked into that skeleton, especially drugs that stick to calcium. Let's imagine a bearded vulture circling over a high pasture. It spots a dead cow, already stripped of most meat by other scavengers. Perfect. The bones are exposed. The marrow is waiting. The strategy works. Except this cow was treated with a powerful anti-inflammatory a few days before it died. In South Asia, a similar drug, diclofenac, wiped out up to 99% of some vulture species in just a few decades. One dose in a carcass. Kidney failure. Done. And yes, these guys are all real. Entire vulture communities crashed because a painkiller built for livestock turned out to be a microscopic wrecking ball for birds that clean up the mess. See, that story is not some distant tragedy. It's a warning label for mountains. Other drugs, like certain NSAIDs and even some antibiotics, can also linger in bone and marrow, turning what should be a nutrient jackpot into a slow, invisible poison. That's just the legal stuff. Then you have the outright weapons. Farmers or poachers lay poisoned baits meant for wolves, foxes, or feral dogs, meat laced with pesticides or strychnine, dropped in valleys and on ridgelines. The target predator eats it, staggers off, dies. Hours later, our bone specialist arrives. It doesn't have to touch the soft tissue. It can just crack the legs, swallow the shards, and still get a full dose of whatever killed the original animal. You might think the real danger is one big, catastrophic hit. But low-level, repeated exposure is its own kind of disaster. A little toxin in this goat, a residue in that sheep, a sublethal dose from a poisoned dog. The bird doesn't fall out of the sky. It just gets slightly weaker, its immune system a bit worse, its eggs a bit thinner, its chicks a bit less likely to make it through a cold snap. Stack that across years, and a population that already lives on the edge, late maturity, few chicks, huge home ranges, suddenly has no buffer when storms, habitat loss, or food shortages hit. This is the world of death by 1,000 invisible cuts. Well, evolution armed the bearded vulture to eat rotting flesh, shatter giant bones, and bathe its feathers in rust for fun. But it never had to solve for anti-inflammatories, pesticides, and random chemical cocktails hiding inside its dinner. The bones stayed the same. We're the ones who changed what's stored in them. So, if you're a mountain shepherd watching this rust-stained bird spiral over your flock, you're not thinking about trace metals and bone chemistry. You're thinking, that thing is coming for my sheep. And for centuries, people were absolutely sure it was. Let's imagine you're in the Alps 300 years ago. A giant shadow passes over your goats, wings almost 3 meters across, carrying what looks like a skull. You might think, yeah, that's a demon. What you actually find in the old records is a name, lammergeier. Literally, lamb vulture. People believed these birds hunted lambs, calves, even children. Because what else could something that big and that dramatic possibly be doing up there? See, once a bird gets branded as the lamb killer, the stories start snowballing. Suddenly, it's not just stealing livestock, it's dropping things from the sky. Stones, bones, and in one of the most famous legends, tortoises. The Greek playwright Aeschylus supposedly dies because a bearded vulture mistakes his bald head for a rock, drops a tortoise on it, and roll credits. Is that actually how he died? Almost certainly not. But you can see why that story stuck. And yes, these guys are all real. Bearded vultures really do fly high with heavy objects and smash them on rocks. Mostly bones, sometimes tortoises, because evolution apparently thought bone-eating artillery bird was a fun idea. From the ground, though, you just see a cold silhouette hauling giant bones and skulls through the sky. You don't see the careful targeting, the specific cliffs they reuse, the whole learned technique. So people filled in the gaps with sky spirits, omens, and death birds haunting the passes. You might think that's just folklore, but what you actually find is that fear has a body count. Once a species is labeled as a child-stealing monster, people don't wait for proof. They poison carcasses. They shoot anything with long wings and a beard. Meanwhile, this bird that everyone's terrified of is actually cleaning up disease risk leftovers, stripping carcasses down to the last sterile fragment of bone. Modern science comes in and ruins the horror movie a bit. No, they're not hunting your kids. They rarely touch live animals at all. They're bone specialists, turning the stuff other scavengers can't use into fuel. The same behavior that looked like a curse from above is just a very weird recycling program. But changing that story hasn't been easy. Conservationists had to rebrand an entire myth. From lammergeier, lamb killer, to bearded vulture, the high-altitude bone cleaner. Once people start seeing a mountain janitor instead of a sky demon, support for protection suddenly looks a lot less like superstition and a lot more like pride. So, if rewriting the legend can pull a death bird back from the edge, what happens when you stop chasing the story and actually follow one of these vultures to where it eats? Let's imagine you actually take that challenge. You stop chasing the legend, grab your binoculars and a long lens that feels way too heavy at this altitude, and hike up to a windy ridge before sunrise. The air is thin and cold, the kind that makes your teeth hurt when you breathe. Below you, the cliffs just drop away into a maze of rock, snow, and tiny distant dots that might be chamois, or just rocks pretending to be chamois. You might think a bone eater would be loud and dramatic, like a cartoon vulture with thunder and ominous music. But what you actually find is silence, just wind hissing in your ears and that weird high-altitude ringing you get when it's too quiet. So you scan the sky, back and forth, waiting for anything that looks bigger than the usual crows and ravens patrolling the slopes. At first, you miss it. Your brain files it under just another bird. Then it banks. The wings are long and almost plank straight, the tail a sharp diamond instead of a fan, and suddenly your heart rate jumps. This is the world of the bearded vulture. It glides along the cliff face like it's tracing the rock with a ruler, using updrafts you can't see, barely moving its wings as it cruises past your ridge in total silence. It doesn't even look at you. It tilts just a few degrees and aims itself toward a distant smear of brown and white on a scree slope. Through the lens, that smear resolves into a carcass that other scavengers have already picked mostly clean. You can still see scraps of hide, but the meat is basically gone. Perfect. The lammergeier drops its landing gear, folds those giant wings, and touches down with the casual confidence of something that absolutely knows it's the specialist here. See, it doesn't rush. It walks through the bones like someone browsing a used bookstore, nudging pieces with its beak, testing weight and shape. You watch it ignore ribs and vertebrae, then finally settle on a long leg bone. It grips, hops, and then, with a few heavy wing beats, is airborne again, that pale bone dangling from its talons like the world's strangest banner. You follow it, trying not to lose the tiny dark shape against sunlit rock. Well, the bird has a plan. It heads to what looks, from your ridge, like just another broken patch of cliff. But this is its ossuary, a favorite impact zone. It climbs, stalls for a heartbeat, then lets the bone go. You actually flinch when it hits. The crack echoes up the valley, sharp and final. Before the dust even settles, the vulture is already spiraling down. It lands right on the impact site, picks through the shattered pieces, and snaps up glowing white fragments like popcorn. You're not reading about bone eating anymore. You're watching a living, breathing bird run a routine it's practiced for years. And as it lifts off with one last shard, you start wondering, how does a stomach handle that much rock-hard calcium without just giving up? What kind of internal chemistry lets this even work? Well, here's the uncomfortable twist. All that insane chemistry and bone-cracking skill only works if the mountains keep serving bones in the first place. What happens if the buffet just stops? Let's imagine you zoom out from that one bird to the entire landscape. For most of history, high pastures were full of free-ranging sheep, goats, yaks, cattle. Some died in storms, some fell off cliffs, some just didn't make it through the winter. Their carcasses froze, dried, and slowly turned into exactly what a bearded vulture wants: clean, sun-bleached skeletons. You might think that sounds grim, but for a bone eater, that's basically a grocery aisle. But what you actually find today in a lot of places is way more organized. Herds are fenced in. Dead livestock are collected by trucks. Sanitary rules say carcasses have to be removed or burned because of disease risk. And every time a farmer calls a rendering plant instead of leaving a dead cow on the slope, that's one less giant calcium jackpot on the menu. See, the bird's superpower is tuned to a world where death is messy and spread out. We're quietly cleaning that world up. Now add climate change stirring the pot. These birds rely not just on livestock, but on wild ungulates too. Ibex, chamois, wild sheep, cold, snowy winters, sudden blizzards, avalanches. All of that used to create big, predictable pulses of mortality. A bad snow year could mean a hidden avalanche chute full of frozen carcasses that feed bone eaters for months. So, what happens when the snowpack gets thinner, arrives later, melts earlier, or avalanches in different places entirely? You might think fewer blizzards is good news for mountain goats, but for a specialist that's evolved to cash in on those rare, brutal events, shifting snow patterns can scramble the timing and location of its food. Too warm, and animals don't die in the same numbers. Too icy at the wrong time, and they die in spots that are harder to find or reach. To patch the gap, some regions now run feeding stations, dropping off bones from slaughterhouses at predictable sites. And yes, these guys are all real. Official bone buffets, like a cafeteria for sky dinosaurs. It helps, but it also concentrates the birds. Which means if there's lead in a single batch of bones, or a toxin, a whole local population can get hit at once. If natural bone availability drops too low, these vultures don't suddenly become flexible omnivores. This is the world of extreme specialization. They either decline, or they start pushing closer to villages, roadkill, dumps, and risky human spaces. More collisions, more poisoning, more conflict. So underneath all the flashy adaptations, you're looking at a simple rule. No bones, no bone eater. That razor-focused stomach acid, that rock-dropping behavior, that whole gothic lifestyle? Without a steady supply of skeletons, evolution's coolest party trick turns into a trap. And the next big question is, what exactly are we putting into the bones that are left? Well, once you realize we've been quietly booby-trapping the skeleton buffet with lead and vet drugs, the no bones, no bone eater problem suddenly gets a sequel. Do we start serving curated bones? You might think the obvious fix is just vulture restaurants, all-you-can-eat bone bars. And yes, these guys are all real. Across parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia, conservationists literally run feeding stations where they dump carcasses and big leg bones that have been checked for lead shot and banned drugs like diclofenac. No poison, no fragments of metal, just clean skeletons in the middle of the mountains. This is the world of the ethical bone buffet. Let's imagine you're a bearded vulture in a valley where traditional herding is gone. Wild ungulates are scarce, and hunters switched to non-lead ammo years ago. But there still just aren't many bodies. A feeding station can be the difference between a struggling pair and a whole, recovering population. In places like the Alps and the Pyrenees, these sites basically acted as training wheels, letting reintroduced birds find predictable, safe food while they figured out the landscape. So on paper, it looks great. You pull toxic bones out of the system, you put safe ones back in, and the bone eater gets to keep being weird. But what you actually find is that once you start centralizing food, you're not just saving birds, you're rewriting their entire schedule. If dinner always shows up in the same valley on the same day, why soar huge distances searching cliff after cliff? Movement patterns shrink, migration routes can shift, and younger birds may grow up keying on trucks and tractors instead of carcasses. There's another catch. Pack a bunch of vultures into one predictable hotspot, and you've basically built a disease convention center. Pathogens that would have burned out in scattered carcasses can suddenly jump from bird to bird, or between species, because everyone's shoulder to shoulder on the same rib cage. And if the station shuts down, a population that learned to lean on free bones can crash fast. So inside conservation circles, the argument gets spicy. Do you keep investing in artificial feeding, micromanaging who eats what and where, or do you focus almost everything on fixing the upstream problems, banning toxic drugs, phasing out lead, stopping intentional poisoning, protecting open grazing, and wild herbivore habitat so natural carcasses come back? One side says, they'll die before the system recovers if we don't feed them. The other says, they'll never rewild if we don't stop. See, saving a bone specialist is not as simple as dumping skeletons in a pile and walking away. Every bone you move is a tiny vote about how that whole mountain ecosystem should work in 50 years. And the real twist is still coming. Even when the bones are safe, what we put into them can quietly reach all the way into a vulture's DNA. So, if the bones themselves can be loaded with invisible poisons, how did this bird ever convince us it wasn't the villain in the story? Let's imagine you're not in a lab. You're on your couch in the 1960s, watching one of the first color nature documentaries. You might think the narrator is about to call this thing a lamb killer, a baby snatcher, a monster with wings. And for a long time, that's exactly what people did. But what you actually find, as the decades roll on, is that field guides and documentaries quietly change the script. The bearded vulture stops being a horror movie extra and starts being introduced like a weird specialist, the bird that eats what everyone else leaves behind. See, once cameras started following them for more than 30 seconds, The story got harder to spin as pure evil. You watch one patiently circle a carcass, ignore the meat, and then daintily pick up a femur like it's a baguette. You see it climb into cold air, drop the bone onto a rock, and repeat until dinner explodes into swallowable shards. That's not a villain. That's a technician. Fast forward to now, and the rebrand goes into overdrive. High-speed drones and giant telephoto lenses give you ultra-sharp footage of a bearded vulture dropping a cow bone from 80 meters, then folding those huge wings and drifting down like it's no big deal. Viral clips slow the moment of impact until the bone pops like glass. And yes, these guys are all real. No CGI, just physics, and very committed recycling. Then there's the look. That orange, rust-stained chest you see all over Instagram. That's not natural pigment. They actually bathe in iron-rich mud. You might think it's just a vulture that lost a fight with a self-tanner, but what you actually find is a kind of status signal, a way of saying, I know all the secret mineral spas in this valley. And because everyone now carries a camera, citizen science jumps in. Birdwatchers post grainy first sightings from alpine trails, then sharper shots from hides, then full bone drop sequences. Those records don't just farm likes, they feed databases, map territories, and suddenly whole villages can point at a dot on a conservation map and say, that's our bird. Ownership gets bigger than any one scientist. On the ground, outreach teams hike into mountain schools with skulls, plastic femurs, and very honest slideshows. They show kids what the bird actually eats, how its stomach acid can melt bone, and why that makes valleys cleaner and safer for livestock. The old stories about babies being carried away start to sound kind of boring next to this bird digests skeletons. And the wild part is, the exact traits that once made it a monster, bone diet, rust-colored feathers, those intense red eyes, are now its best PR assets. This is the world of conservation mascots where the stranger you are, the easier it is to care. But if weirdness can save a species, what happens when the one thing it can't adapt to is us quietly changing the rules of the mountains again? So, if weirdness can save a species, what does a bird this weird actually tell you about how evolution works? Let's imagine you're trying to design a bone eater from scratch. You'd probably start with some horror movie blueprint. Steel beak, giant jaws, maybe a blender for a stomach. But what you actually find in the bearded vulture is way messier and way smarter. See, all its famous party tricks are locked together. High-altitude soaring isn't just dramatic cinematography, it's the delivery system for that bone-dropping behavior. The bird rides cold mountain air up, carries a cow femur higher than some small plains, and smashes it onto its favorite rock. The ultra-acidic stomach isn't a random upgrade either. It only makes sense if you're then swallowing those shattered chunks almost whole and trying to liquefy the inside. Even the orange plumage plugs into the same lifestyle. Bathing in iron-rich mud near carcass sites might signal status, but it also means you're hanging out exactly where big bones tend to appear. You might think this looks like a perfectly executed master plan, as if evolution sat down one day and said, bone-eating vulture, go. But evolution doesn't plan. It tinkers. Long before bone-dropping sky gremlins, you had more generic scavenging birds picking at whatever was left on a carcass. A slightly stronger stomach here, a bolder bird that stayed later at the buffet there, one that could carry heavier scraps a bit farther. Tiny differences, stacked over thousands of generations, gradually pushed some lineages toward the one resource nobody else really wanted, the skeleton. And yes, these guys are all real. This is the world of natural selection going, What if we just keep turning the dial? Stronger acid, better soaring wings, smarter bone-dropping technique that young birds literally have to practice like a weird, deadly sport. At some point, you're not looking at a generalist scavenger anymore. You're looking at a vertebrate that gets up to 90% of its calories from something most animals can't even bite. But that creativity comes with strings attached. Specialization is like signing a very detailed contract with your environment. You become incredibly efficient at one thing, but incredibly bad at switching careers. The bearded vulture is amazing at wringing nutrients from old bones, yet that same focus makes it vulnerable when the rules change. If humans shoot animals with lead, the toxins end up in the bones. If carcasses disappear because livestock is cleaned up or wild herds shrink, you can't just suddenly become a pigeon. So, what is this bird really showing you? That the edges of what vertebrate bodies can do are way farther out than they look from the middle. If a lineage can crawl from generic meat picker to almost pure bone digester, turning the symbol of death into the basis of life, what other impossible transformations are quietly playing out right now in niches we barely even notice yet? So, let's imagine you're back on that mountain trail where we started. A shadow passes over you. A bone whistles through the cold air and explodes on the rocks a few meters away. The first time, it just felt like random chaos from the sky. Now you actually know you just walked into a kitchen. You might think that's an overstatement. But what you actually find, when you rewind everything we've seen, is a whole life strategy hidden in that one crash. The bearded vulture has picked the right bone, flown to the right height, aimed at the right rock shelf it's used 100 times before, and turned something almost useless into high-energy marrow and splinter snacks. This is the world of a bird that solved a really weird puzzle. How do you live mostly on bones? Behavior, anatomy, ecosystem, all bolted together into one giant workaround. It doesn't just wait for meat to rot. It lets other scavengers and predators strip the easy stuff, then calmly steps in for the final, hardest leftovers that nobody else can touch. Inside, it's even stranger. That stomach acid hovering around pH 1, the muscular gizzard, the gut tune to pull calcium and fat out of what is basically rock-hard collagen and mineral. Outside, the brain and wings doing physics, turning gravity into a hammer. You're watching an animal run a demolition company and a chemical refinery in the same body. And yes, these guys are all real. You've got a vulture that cleans up the skeletons scattered across huge mountain ranges, from the Pyrenees to the Himalaya. By eating bones and marrow that would otherwise just sit there, it's recycling calcium, locking away potential disease sources, and quietly keeping these high-altitude ecosystems a little less gross. See, that's the part we usually miss. We notice the dramatic dive, the huge wings, the creepy red eyes. But the real flex is ecological. This bird has carved out a niche so specific that it barely competes with anyone. Griffin vultures, ravens, wolves, bears, they all clock out when the flesh is gone. The bearded vulture is the night shift. But that specialization comes with a price. Poison in a single carcass, lead fragments in a hunter's bullet, or a badly placed power line can hit these birds way harder than a generalist. Change where and when big animals die, and suddenly the bone buffet shrinks. You get a lineage tuned for millennia to bones everywhere, and we're rapidly editing the menu. So, people are trying to patch the system. Reintroduction projects in the Alps and beyond, rules to pull toxic baits and lead ammo, power line fixes, GPS tags, public campaigns turning bone-eating sky demon into actually vital mountain janitor. It's a test run. Can we tweak our behavior fast enough to keep a specialist like this going while the world gets warmer, busier, and louder? Because if evolution can take a fairly standard meat picker and push it all the way to almost pure bone digester, what does it say about us if we can't manage the much simpler trick of just not poisoning the bones? And if this is what's possible with bones, what other extreme, almost unbelievable solutions are circling over our heads right now, waiting for you to look up? So, if evolution already did the hard part and built a bird that can basically drink skeletons, what's your part in this story? Let's imagine you actually live in bearded vulture country. High mountains, cold wind, tiny dots circling way above you that are not, in fact, drones. You might think this is all way too giant scale for one person to matter, but what you actually find is that a lot of the threats hitting these birds are really boring. Human decisions, stuff like what bullets hunters use, how we leave carcasses, and where we put our power lines. If you're in Europe, East Africa, or Central Asia, you're in the world of the bone eater. Local conservation groups are already out there tracking nests, testing bones for toxins, and trying to stop poison before it ever hits a carcass. They need people. That can be donations, sure, but also volunteering, reporting sightings, or just backing them when they say, hey, maybe sprinkling neurotoxins across the food web is bad. One huge thing, lead. When hunters switch to lead-free ammunition, scavengers stop quietly accumulating a cold, metallic death in their stomachs. Same meal, different outcome. So if you hunt, you can actually change that today. If you don't, you can still push for lead-free rules at ranges and in hunting areas, or support groups campaigning for that shift. Then there's the buffet layout. Bearded vultures need carcasses that are left out long enough for the meat eaters to strip them, but not loaded with veterinary drugs or poison. Supporting carcass disposal practices that leave safe, drug-free remains in designated areas basically turns the landscape into a network of vulture restaurants instead of minefields. Farmers and herders who work with conservation projects on this are already seeing more vultures overhead. And yes, these guys are all real threats. Power lines, wind turbines, ski lifts, even poorly placed cables can turn a gliding bird into a physics lesson. Backing infrastructure, changes that mark lines, bury cables in key corridors, or place turbines away from major flight paths. Sounds dry, but it's literally the difference between ancient sky dragon and collision statistic. But what if you're nowhere near bone-eater territory? You still have scavengers. See, vultures, crows, hyenas, all the cleanup crew get cast as villains way more than they get credit as the sanitation workers they actually are. You can be the person in your friend group who says, no, that bald, slightly ominous bird is what keeps our landscapes from becoming open-air disease buffets. In the description, we've dropped links to vulture conservation projects, plus some very fun rabbit holes on extreme dietary specialists if your brain enjoys the "wait, that's real?" feeling. And if you want more of this, tell me. Drop a comment if you'd watch deep dives on vampire finches, bone-eating worms, blood-drinking bats. Which evolutionary oddball do you want to meet next, and how weird are you willing to get? So, let's imagine you scroll away from the comments and we cut back to the mountains themselves. The sun's dropping behind a jagged ridge, the air's gone thin and cold, and the rock is turning that deep blue-gray that makes everything feel bigger and emptier than it really is. High above it all, a single bearded vulture is circling. No flock, no soundtrack, just one dark shape against a darkening sky, clutching one last bone in its talons like a question mark it hasn't dropped yet. You might think nothing important is happening here. It's just a bird and a bone, right? But what you actually find, if you zoom in, is this slow, deliberate climb. Wing beats that look lazy, but are actually doing ridiculous math with every gust of wind. The vulture rides a rising current, higher, then higher again, bone swinging slightly, waiting for the angle only it seems to notice. Then, without drama, it lets go. The bone falls almost politely at first, just a pale line against the rock. Then gravity remembers its job. It accelerates, spinning, aimed at a patch of stone that's been used for this exact ritual for generations. An ancient ossuary. And when it hits, the whole valley answers. A single, sharp crack that ricochets off the cliffs like a final punctuation mark at the end of some long, weird sentence evolution has been writing for millions of years. In that sound, you're hearing way more than calcium meeting granite. You're hearing an entire history of tiny mutations that turned a regular scavenger into the only vertebrate that lives almost entirely on bones. You're hearing ecosystems quietly cleaned of disease because something decided the leftovers were dinner. You're hearing human stories too. Poisons in carcasses, power lines, reintroduction teams hiking up here with crates and hope and way too many spreadsheets. See, that one falling bone is plugged into invisible systems that stretch from the chemistry of stomach acid all the way to international policy meetings that could really use more snacks and fewer graphs. It's ridiculous. It's beautiful. It's also incredibly fragile. So, let's imagine the mountains without that sound. No crack, no circling shadow, just wind and rocks and carcasses that linger a little too long. You might not notice the difference on a postcard, but you'd feel it if you lived here. More rot, more disease. Fewer of those strange, theatrical moments where the sky suddenly reminds you it's alive. As long as bones are still falling and wings are still wheeling above them, we're not out of time yet. We actually get to choose what kind of world we leave behind. One where the strangest specialists still have room to do their bizarre, essential jobs, or one that's been edited down to the same few hardy, boring survivors. And yes, these guys are all real. The question is, for how long? And what are you going to do with the tiny piece of that echo that reaches you through a screen?